Good evening. It is my pleasure to welcome you to St. Albans Episcopal Church and to our inaugural season of the Howe Lectures. My name is Adam Dawkins. I'm the priest and rector here at St. Albans Episcopal Church, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. St. Albans was founded in 1931 as a parish of the Episcopal Diocese of Los Angeles to serve UCLA and the Westwood community. Over the years, countless students and faculty and university community members have called St. Albans their spiritual home. For nearly a century, serving the campus community has been our privilege and our great blessing. And that legacy continues through the Howe Lectures, a new initiative here at St. Albans. Named for Sandra Shumway Howe and Daniel Walker Howe, the Howe Lectures continue St. Albans' service to the community by providing thought-provoking intellectual formation for members of the UCLA community, our parish and diocesan community, and beyond. This inaugural season features some of the greatest Christian thinkers of the modern era, and tonight is certainly no exception. Daniel Walker Howe is Rhodes Professor of American History, Emeritus at Oxford University in England, and Professor of History Emeritus at UCLA. He received his Bachelor of Arts at Harvard University in 1959, magna cum laude, in American History and Literature, and his Doctor of Philosophy in History at the University of California, Berkeley in 1966. He was awarded an honorary Doctor of Humanities degree from Weber State University in 2014. Daniel Howe's connection with Oxford University began when he matriculated at Magdalen College to read modern history in 1960, receiving his Master of Arts degree in 1965. Sandra Shumway Howe graduated from St. Anne's College, Oxford, in 1960 and received a master's degree as well. Daniel Walker Howe has taught at Yale University from 1966 to 1973, at UCLA from 1973 to 1992, where he chaired the history department, and at Oxford from 1992 to 2002. In 2011, he spent a semester as visiting professor at Wofford College in Spartanburg, South Carolina. In 1989 and 1990, Howe was Harold Vian Harmsworth Professor of American History at Oxford and a Fellow of the Queen's College at Oxford. Daniel Howe won the 2008 Pulitzer Prize for History for What Hath God Wrought, his most famous book. He was president of the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic in 2001 and is fellow of both the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the Royal Historical Society. Daniel Walker Howe and Sandra Faye Shumway Howe were married in September 1961. They have 3 children, Rebecca, Christopher, and Stephen, and 6 grandchildren. Sandra and Dan are longtime beloved members of St. Albans Episcopal Church, and I'm pleased to say that Sandra and Dan are with us this evening. Please join me in welcoming Sandra and Dan. Again, a very, very warm welcome to St. Albans. Everyone is welcome here, especially you. And it is now my privilege to introduce Diane Sublett, our senior warden, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Hi, everybody. It's so great to look out and see you in an evening. I'm so used to doing this in the congregation on Sunday morning. Greetings and thank you once again to Dan and Sandra for your gift as our congregants and your gift here for the lectures. It's my great pleasure to introduce an Englishman that would be close to Dan's heart, I think, and someone who grew up in East Yorkshire, Andrew Davison, and ascended to University of Oxford, where he was not only accepted but completed 2 degrees, one in chemistry and then later his doctorate in biochemistry. Having decided, I think, that his intellectual pursuits had only begun and he had not yet nearly completed his educational pathway, he proceeded to University of Cambridge, where he then began studies in theology and completed there his doctorate in theology. After training, our speaker became ordained as an Anglican priest in 2004. It was after that when he began in his posting as a tutor, first in Oxford and then in Cambridge, that he discovered his love for learning and particularly for students. And it is there that he has this connection to us at St. Albans. Our congregants, Jason and Abby, were privileged to receive his gifts of attracting those students and interesting them by taking them to the Corpus Christi wine cellar. That's a good thing for students, but they didn't drink any wine, they could only look. And then to the library, where the Parker librarian showed them the bestiary collection. No, they did not get to see the Canterbury Bible, maybe later. After many years, our speaker then produced 11 books on science and Christian doctrine, and he's going to talk to us this evening about the most recent one. In 2023, and since that time, he has been Dean of Chapel and Professor of Theology and Natural History at the Oxford University. I think it's Oxford University. He'll correct me on that if I'm wrong. He will talk to us this evening with a wonderful title, something that when I first saw it made me think, oh, he should be working for NASA. The exploration of implications of life in the universe. He's a man who loves California, loves our natural beauty and our mythologies, and of course, our weather. So I want you all to give our speaker, Andrew Davison, a warm California welcome to begin talking with us about life in the universe. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that wonderfully warm welcome and for the invitation to speak to you this evening. It's a particular honor to be speaking in this inaugural season of the Howe Lectures, not least because of that wonderful Oxford connection. I have a great fondness for this city. I think this is probably my 4th visit, and I note a couple of connections that I was born, as was said, in East Yorkshire in the town of Beverley, which I suspect, although spelt differently, must be the progenitor of Beverly Hills. And I happen to be a canon of St. Albans Cathedral, the original St. Albans, so I feel like I'm much connected with this place already. I'm going to talk at the beginning about some of the provocations for this work from science, because I think this exploration of life in the universe and the discovery of planets all over the place is one of the most fascinating areas of contemporary science. And then I'm going to talk about the place of thinking about life beyond Earth in the history of Christian theology, because it's a surprising one, and we've been thinking about it actually a lot longer than you might think. And then I'll turn up some of the theological topics, God, creation, sin as salvation, all these sorts of things, and ask what the implications might be of the presence of life elsewhere in the universe, with a little bit of social science slipped in the middle. And then there'll be plenty of time, I think, for questions at the end. I noticed that the advert for this lecture, the poster, which is beautifully put together, shows me at my absolutely most clerical in a cassock and gown. There's been no crisis of vocation in the meantime. It's just that I'm traveling around the States giving some lectures out of a small suitcase. So I'm not in clerical dress this evening, but don't worry about that. There's nothing going on particularly. So let's begin then with some of the provocation from the science and the question, are there planets around other stars? Well, this was an open question right the way through the 20th century, and it was really only until we discovered planets around other stars that we knew that there are. And I think even those who are expecting that have been surprised by just how ubiquitous planets turn out to be. But there were 2 rival theories about how a solar system might form. One was the collision hypothesis, and the other was the nebula hypothesis. And depending on which of these you favored, planets would either be incredibly rare or pretty much common or garden things. So the collision hypothesis. This says you get stuff around a sun, planets and moons and so on, because of a collision, that one star collides with another, or perhaps a comet collides with a star. But if you think about how enormous the distances are between stars, the chances of them colliding with one another are extraordinarily small. So in the entire galaxy, it might only happen a few times. We might quite easily have been the only solar system. Not very much prospect there for life beyond Earth. But the other model, the nebula hypothesis, said that in the very same process by which clouds of dust collapse under gravity and form a star, in that very process you get a disk of dust, and that will tend to coalesce into planets. And so just in the very process of getting stars, you get planets. And the German philosopher Immanuel Kant is one of the people responsible for that theory. Well, in the 19th century, the collision hypothesis was somewhat in the ascendant. And it's true that by the middle of the 20th century, the nebula hypothesis was gaining ground, and partly through mathematical models. But as I say, until we discovered planets around other stars, we couldn't be absolutely sure that there were very many at all. And that discovery is credited to Didier Queloz and Michael Major, who discovered the first planet around another sun in the year 1995. Didier, amazingly, it's a sort of fairy tale story that seems almost too good to be true, was a PhD student at the time. And so in the fullness of time, he received not only a PhD for that work, but indeed the Nobel Prize for Physics, I think, maybe about 5 or 6 years ago. He's professor of astronomy at Cambridge, where I worked until recently, and also at ETH in Zurich, the prestigious scientific university in Zurich. And he's the director of a wonderful new centre in Cambridge, the Leverhulme Centre for Life in the Universe, which I had a hand in setting up, especially with the arts and humanities side of that program. So how would you go about discovering planets around other stars? And here I need a prop, and I think a glass of water will do as well as anything else. Well, if you're lucky and you're staring at a star and there happens to be a planet around it, every now and again the planet will come in front of the star and be exactly in your line of sight, and it will block out the star a little bit. That's not going to happen very often. If you're looking at the planet, the star like this, and there's a planet that's going around like that, it's never going to cover the star. So it's only really if you happen to strike lucky like Didier did. Now, even then, the star's pretty big and the planet's small, and it's not going to make very much difference. It might cut off 1% of the light or even less than that. But if you watch long enough and if you add up the data, the noise starts to drop away, and you can see that periodically the star gets ever so slightly dimmer, and hey presto, you've got evidence for a planet. Another thing you can do is imagine the planets going around the star like this. Well, from one of Newton's laws, the star goes around the planet, but in a certain way the planet goes around the star, but in a certain way the star goes around the planet as well, in as much as for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. So the planet traces out a large orbit, and the sun will be wobbling ever so slightly. But if you look really intently and carefully at the star and you see it wobbling in the sky, this will be good evidence that there's a planet. But you've got to hold your telescope incredibly still, and that's actually quite difficult because of earthquakes and so on. Perhaps not something I should mention in this part of the world. And then a third way you can do it, which turns out to be extremely effective, is if the planet's going around this way, like I said, it's going to tug the star a little bit backwards and forwards. And in fact, if you look at it, the star will end up becoming a little bit bluer, a little bit redder, a little bit bluer, a little bit redder, because of the Doppler shift. So you know about that from an ambulance. An ambulance comes towards you, the pitch is high, and it passes you, and the pitch drops because the waves are compressed at the sound when it's coming towards you, and they're stretched out when it goes behind you. And it works exactly the same for light. So you can see the color of the star shift ever so slightly, and it turns out we can measure the frequency of light incredibly accurately, pretty easily. So it's quite a good way of noticing a star, and a planet around a star. And I think that, as I say, the early first discovery was just that very fortunate occasion when the planet passes in front of the star. The numbers carry on expanding. So last time I checked, which was a couple of months ago, we had discovered 7,344 planets around other stars, and I suspect that number will be creeping up, well, at least towards 7,500 by now, in just over 5,000 planetary systems, of which 1,000 of them were known to have multiple planets. So if you stare at the data long enough, then you can start to get evidence for even more than one planet around a star. This, as I said, the really surprising thing is that planets turn out to be pretty much everywhere. And if you do the mathematics, the maths, as we would say, the math, as you say, then it comes out as something like this, that in the observable universe, there will be something like 16 billion Earth-like planets around sun-like stars. I did that calculation a few years ago. It's probably changed ever so slightly, but you get the order of magnitude. I think that's 1 followed by 23 zeros. And I can honestly say that it's that number that got me interested in this field of work, because maybe life is really rare. Maybe it doesn't get going very often. But if it only gets going 1 in 16 billion times that it might, you'd still have 1 billion planets out there with life on them. So who knows? We've got one other data point which might inform our calculations, which is that life got started on Earth really early, almost implausibly early, earlier than you might expect, in the Hadean epoch, when things were still somewhat Hades-like, with meteorites and volcanoes, and it was a pretty inhospitable place to be, and life got going. So maybe that's one other little bit of data that suggests that maybe life isn't so difficult to get going. But we don't know. But the scientific, the technological developments are really coming on apace with the new James Webb Space Telescope, very well poised for discovering planets. And we're just at the stage where we're able to analyze the gases in the atmosphere around these planets. And I really want to impress upon you what an extraordinary feat of technology that is, because, as I said, you've got a huge star and, relatively speaking, a small planet, but then the atmosphere around that planet is absolutely minuscule compared to the size of the planet, and yet, when the planet goes in front of the star, if you observe carefully enough, you can see the effect of the gases in the atmosphere absorbing at this frequency and that frequency and that frequency, and you can work out what the balance of gases will be in the atmosphere. We're sort of frustratingly just on the cusp of being able to get the data that's just quite good enough, but maybe one more iteration of Space Telescope, and we'll be able to say, something odd is going on there. If you looked at the Earth from a long way away, you would say, why is there this methane in the atmosphere and oxygen at the same time? They're a very reactive combination. Something's knocking the balance of the gases out of whack. And of course that on Earth is life. So we don't need to wait anymore for life to visit us, land, outside Windsor Castle, I suppose maybe the White House, and say, take me to your leader. But even if there's not intelligent life on these planets, if it's got settled and it's established on the planet and it's changing the gases in the atmosphere, pretty soon we should be able to detect it. So who knows? One of these days you'll buy a newspaper, if people still buy newspapers, and it'll say on the front page that life has been discovered. But even if it hasn't, I still think it's a useful exercise. I see myself as being in this line of study, amongst other things, for two reasons. I like the idea of having trained a cohort, a generation of students who will be prepared, who will have thought about this in advance, whom the newspapers and the radio stations can ring up and say, give us a theological line on this. It's good to have thought about these things in advance. Many, many people turn to their religious traditions for advice and guidance and orientation in these big epochal moments. And if you've thought about it a little bit in advance, then your response is going to be a bit more measured, informed, perhaps a little bit less hysterical. But even if we never discover life beyond Earth, I think it's a wonderful set of questions to come at old theological questions from new angles. And I hope that, in what I'm going to say in the rest of this talk, you'll get a sense of how our understanding of what it means to be human, to be made in the image of God, what it means for God to have dwelt amongst us in Christ. All these sorts of questions, I think they get a freshness by looking at them from this new angle. So I want to move on to the question of the place of thinking about biological life beyond Earth in Christian thought. I should say my expertise is largely in European thought, and I work on Christian theology. I know that both Judaism and Islam think about this even slightly earlier than Christianity, and there will be a wonderful story to be told about thought about life beyond Earth in Islam and Judaism, but I'm not the person to try to do that. But the earliest discussion I know in Christianity about the place of life beyond Earth and its implications for theology, they both come from the middle of the 15th century. So Nicholas of Cusa, I think probably the most interesting theologian of the 15th century, and no weird radical. He was probably the second, by the end of his life, he had the second most important role in the Vatican after the Pope. So he was really an establishment figure and was not at all afraid to ask these speculative questions about life beyond Earth. And the other is a Franciscan friar called William of Varillon, and they both wrote, well, Nicholas of Cusa about a single paragraph, William maybe a page, double column page, no more than that. But they thought about life beyond Earth, they took it in their stride, and they moved on. There are two figures. I thought I would very briefly mention a few more, maybe bringing the total up to 12. So Giordano Bruno, a sort of renegade Dominican, burned at the stake in, I think, 1600. It was said that he got into trouble for thinking that there was life beyond Earth, but he actually said some other things that were more likely to have got himself on the wrong side of the Inquisition, like that the world was made out of God, for instance. That's not going to go down very well in 1600. So he did talk about life beyond Earth. He did think the universe was of infinite extent, with infinite amount of everything. And he did get himself into trouble. And it's possible, I think, you can just about discern that in the years after the Reformation, the church is not at ease. People are a bit tense. You find Melanchthon, for instance, Luther's right-hand man, who interestingly wrote a science textbook that was used in Lutheran high schools for centuries afterwards. He didn't like the idea of life beyond Earth either. So Bruno perhaps went a bit, he was an advocate, he got himself into trouble. Melanchthon shows the church being a little bit wary about it. But once the dust has settled on the Reformation, you find people, as I say, taking it in their stride again. John Wilkins, who was Bishop of Chester, I'll talk about him. John Ray, who's often described as the father of British natural history writing, so the David Attenborough of his time. He wrote a beautiful book, The Wisdom of God in the Works of Creation, something like that. And he has just half a page where he says, yeah, those stars are other suns, and they'll have planets around them, and they'll be full of other creatures, and God knows about them and loves them, and just says that and moves on. Anne Viscountess Conway, a very interesting sort of Neoplatonic philosopher of the late 17th century. It's quite important in her philosophical system that there's life beyond Earth. Anthony Trollope, the archetypal Victorian novelist in Barchester Towers, I think, so just the most Victorian of Victorian novels. When he wants to have a group of women in a drawing room talking about the things that women were talking about in, I suppose, late 19th century, he has them talking about life beyond Earth and even a little bit its theological significance. And he wasn't mocking that, he wasn't coming up with some extraordinary science fiction scenario, he was just reporting the kind of thing that educated people were talking about in their drawing rooms at the time. Charles Spurgeon, the great Baptist theologian, in at least 2 sermons that I know of, talks about life beyond Earth and is perfectly happy with it. Alice Meynell, a wonderful Roman Catholic poet of the early 20th century. I'm going to end by reading her great poem, Christ in the Universe. And of course, C.S. Lewis, both in his Cosmic Trilogy, which is quite well known, exploring exactly this theme, although in our own solar system. But there's also a nice little essay that he wrote called Religion and Rocketry. And if you want to read a few more words on this topic, it's not a bad place to start. So what are my impressions having read this? Well, first of all, it was a real joy to me. I was in Princeton for almost a year on a NASA-funded scheme, which gave me the opportunity to write the book. I really didn't think there would be this long historical story, and I was delighted to come across it. It's impressive that most of these people seem to have taken the idea of life beyond Earth in their stride. If anything, theologians were often rather profligate in thinking about how much life there might be out there. So you get some slightly spurious arguments like, God wouldn't make a habitable place without putting inhabitants in it. So every habitable place would be inhabited. There's probably a flaw in the logic there, but it meant that people were, as I say, somewhat profligate about how much life they thought there might be. If I'm frustrated about anything in the historical picture that I've just told you, it's that people were often just not perturbed enough to really write about it very much. You get a sentence here, a paragraph here, maybe a page there, and they just move on. They're unruffled. And I would say, criticizing some of the work of the past couple of decades, of course it's become a big theme because of the discovery of other planets, there was a bit of a tendency to take those maybe 24 asides that people had made in their theological writing and just kind of anthologize and re-anthologize it. And with my book, I wanted both to just write something, I suppose, longer and more involved than had been written before, but I also thought, I want to work with the 99.99% of theology that's not about life beyond Earth, but might be relevant for it, rather than looking at the fragments of things that have been written about it, but as I say, often just as asides. So, theological topics. I'm going to begin by saying something about Revelation, creation, and since I'm in LA, something about angels. Then I'll have a little bit of social science, and then a few more theological topics. So Revelation, there are, I think, no extraterrestrial creatures in the Bible. And does that matter? This, I think, raises interesting questions for us about what the Bible is for. Now, it's certainly true that there are some Christians who say, I know absolutely categorically that there's no life beyond Earth because it's not mentioned in the Bible. There are American conservative evangelical writers that say that. It's also become quite a significant perspective amongst the hierarchy of the Russian Orthodox Church, there's a statement about how there can't be life beyond Earth because the Bible doesn't mention it. But, I mean, you don't need me rather to show you that this might be a slightly flawed argument. There are no duck-billed platypuses in the Bible, or kangaroos, or aardvarks, but I have it on good authority that those things exist. But it does, I think, provoke us to ask some useful questions. What's the Bible for? What does it say? What does it not say? Why is that? I mean, of course, it's a human document. There's a human story to be told. But even if you took the most exalted sense of the inspiration of Scripture, I think there's no reason to suppose that it's trying to do the work of a scientific textbook for us. So John Calvin is a really good writer about this because he was very much a humanist. He's interested in astronomy. And he says, I'll quote John Calvin in his commentary on Genesis. Astronomy unfolds the admirable wisdom of God. Now, Moses did not wish to withdraw us from this pursuit by omitting such things. So the fact that there's not astronomy in Genesis is no slight on astronomers. It's just that, had he spoken of things generally unknown, the uneducated might have pleaded an excuse that such subjects were beyond their capacity. So he thinks that the reason that there aren't these great flights of science in the Scriptures is because people might say, oh, I'm not clever enough for that. I haven't got, high school maths enough. That the Bible's not for me. But Calvin is saying the Bible is about our relationship with God. It's about sin and redemption. It's about how to live a good life. It needs to be for everybody. It's not trying to be a scientific textbook. And he has this lovely idea of accommodation. You find it in Bonaventure and John Chrysostom and plenty of other people as well. But Calvin's a great writer on accommodation. That God is a good communicator and therefore speaks to us in the way that we can understand. He says, God speaks to us like nurses lisp with children. They sort of speak baby talk with children. We just do it naturally. He thinks the Bible is like that, God sort of speaking to us at our level. And there's a lovely passage in Calvin where he says, if you want to know about astronomy, and that's a wonderful thing, go and talk to the astronomers. It's just not what the Bible's for. And even as early as the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas writes that he knows that Jupiter is bigger than the moon. So, because in Genesis there are the two great lights, the sun and the moon. He says, well, actually it turns out that there's an even bigger thing out there than the moon. Why is it not mentioned? And it's because the scriptures is about a human story and a human perspective, as I say, not trying to be a scientific textbook. And there's a lovely example. I missed out John Wilkins earlier on, Master of Wadham College, Oxford, then a Trinity College, Cambridge, an Anglican bishop of Chester, with some, I think, Puritan leanings. He wrote a lovely book about life on the moon, with one of those amazing titles that goes on for line after line. And although I have to break it to you, there isn't life on the moon, he got that wrong. It's still a fascinating book because of the questions that he poses himself and the answers that he gives. And he was a great enthusiast for science, and indeed one of the first secretaries and founders of the Royal Society, one of the great scientific societies of the world. And he comes up with two lovely reasons why there's not this kind of science in the Bible. And he's a real science geek. I really like this, as being such a person myself. He says, there isn't this science in the Bible because it would be just too interesting. It would be such a distraction from all the things that we're supposed to be reading about that we would just get obsessed by all these wonderful scientific things. But the other thing he does, which I think is really beautiful for someone who helped found the Royal Society, is he says, God tells us what we need to know, and then when it comes to science, he just says, there's the world, just, have at it. Put your lab coat on, get your telescope and your microphone, and be my guest, knock yourself out, go and investigate the world. It's there for you to study. And I think that's a really lovely vision from this bishop who was also a founder of the Royal Society. So that's something to say about Revelation. Let me move on to creation. One of the things there I think that we can ask is, how would the idea of multiplicity of life feature in Christian theology? Would we be threatened by the idea that there's lots of it? And here my great theological hero is Thomas Aquinas from the 13th century, and he has a beautiful vision of how it's actually integral to creation that it should be varied and multiple and full of difference. And here's a lovely quotation. He says, God brought things into being so that God's goodness might be communicated to creatures and be represented by them. And because God's goodness could not adequately be represented by one creature alone, God produced many and diverse creatures, that what was wanting in one, in the representation of the divine goodness, might be supplied by another. For goodness, which in God is simple and uniform, in creatures is manifold and divided. So lovely, I think, Christian Platonist view there of the idea that the infinite, simple plenitude of God is appropriately displayed, reflected in the world, in diversity and multiplicity. So from my perspective, if the world turns out to be full of lots of different kinds of life, that fits very much with that vision for me. That my PhD supervisor, Catherine Pickstock, once said, multiplicity is the complement that finitude pays to infinitude. Just off the top of her head, in the middle of a supervision, she said that. And I think that vision that very, very easily accommodates diversity and difference here of life is an appealing one. Also on this theme of creation, you get people, there's a French theologian called Jean Guiton, I think, in the 20th century, who said, well, there must be life beyond Earth, because otherwise the plinth would be too big for the sculpture. By which he means, if the entire universe was a plinth, so that the one sculpture was life on planet Earth, there's a sort of disparity about that. The plinth is too big for the sculpture. Well, I think I'm very happy about there being lots of life in the universe, but I think he gets this wrong twice over. One is, I don't think that the entire universe is too great a plinth for the marvel of what we see on Earth. I think the fact that there are in front of me people who are aware, who have memory and intellect and will and love and moral capacity, and we can be having this conversation, that is an extraordinary thing. And if it took the entire universe for that to be possible, and it only happened here, I don't think the universe would be excessively big. And I do have a sense of it being very big. But I also think that Guitton was wrong to say that the Earth is just a plinth. All those nebulae and all those planets that we can't see and the beautiful galaxies and all the rest, I don't think they're there just to support us. They have value in their own right. And so for both of those reasons, I think the plinth is too big for the sculpture argument for us being the only life is not particularly accurate. And the third thing I wanted to say in this discussion, first discussion of some theological themes, was just to bring the angels into it, because we are, after all, in the city of angels. Now, I don't think that extraterrestrial life is angelic or that angelic life is extraterrestrial. For one thing, I'm a Thomist, follow Thomas Aquinas. That is characteristically have been of the perspective that angels don't have bodies at all. They're not material. So I really don't think that ET is angelic and angels are extraterrestrial. But I do think it's really significant that we have this place in our Christian imagination for other forms of life. And that down Christian history, people have, well, they probably also believed in fairies and boggits and all sorts of, other things as well. But certainly, they thought that we were not the only things in the universe that was intelligent. They thought perhaps we weren't even the most glorious thing there was in the universe. It's not all about us. And I think that's really significant, that the angels just hold this place in our imagination that opens up the possibility. It's always already been there, that there's life beyond us, and we might not be the absolute center of everything. I also think the book of Job does a great job of this. So in that great pivotal moment where Job's been railing against God, and the response from God is just to take Job on a kind of safari round the world and show him the stars and probably what a hippopotamus is and crocodiles and all sorts of extraordinary things. And I think there is that sense in Job that there's just a lot of really weird stuff out there, and that God has plans and delights in things, beyond us. And I think that's also quite a helpful vision for thinking about life beyond Earth. It's one of the reasons I love going to aquariums. I think being in an aquarium, a really good one, like Monterey, is, I should say Long Beach, shouldn't I? Long Beach, of course. It's like being in the middle of the book of Job, with just this really weird stuff all around you. And I think that's quite helpful, puts us in our place. The social science I was going to mention is just very simple. It's this fascinating study that shows that if you ask religious people what they think about the prospect of life beyond Earth, they almost always say, like 90% in this study say, oh, we'll take it in our stride, that's fine. And it varies a little bit between religious traditions, different kinds of Christianity, some other religions, but not very much. And even the traditions that you might think would be a bit more perturbed by it people in the pews, if you ask them, will tend to say, this is fine. Ted Peters, who did the work, asked a very clever additional question, which was he asked some people who describe themselves as atheists, what do you think the religious people will say if you ask them the question? And the numbers come in there at what? It's about sort of 60, so at 70-30. So they thought, oh, ask the religious people and they'll say, oh, I'll be completely freaked out about it. But if you actually ask the real religious people, they say, we can take it in our stride. So it's a nice example about how we need some more religious literacy. The religious people can take it in their stride. Ask the people who are not religious what the religious people will say, and they get it completely wrong. There's lots of other interesting social science work to be done. My colleague Tim Jenkins in Cambridge, now retired, has got a great run of, I think, 6 books coming out at the same time, in which he's rather turned the tables, and he takes the astronomers as his subject for social science. So he's not interested in life beyond Earth, particularly, I think. He's interested in people who are interested in life beyond Earth. So they became the guinea pigs in that particular in that study. I also think that this topic of life beyond Earth makes for really good interfaith conversations. So Cambridge, where I was until I just moved to Oxford, has a wonderful Cambridge Interfaith program, and they run summer schools. And a couple of years when I was involved with it, I made Life Beyond Earth my theme. And it's just wonderfully sort of disarming. There are all sorts of things that people from different religions talk about, which we've been talking about for hundreds of years, and sometimes in rather a warlike way. Choose something completely off the wall, like, what would your religion think about life beyond Earth? And everyone's kind of in it together. It's all very exploratory, it's kind of exciting, people having to think for the first time about it. I found it to be a really good topic for interfaith conversations. So I'm going to end with two more theological themes. Something about the image of God, the idea of human beings being made in the image of God, and something about the incarnation, in which I will use my Star Wars analogy. The image of God. My experience with students is there's always a significant number each year who are kind of crestfallen about the prospect of life beyond Earth. And it often comes down to the idea of the image of God. And they say things like, I used to think that we were really special, but if it turns out there's lots of life out there, it turns out that I'm not. Or it turns out I used to think we were made in the image of God, but if there's lots of life out there, then it turns out that we're not. Now, I find this pretty incomprehensible, but I think I've got to the bottom of it. One part of it is to say, in Genesis, only human beings are described as being in the image of God. And then people jump to the conclusion that that means the image of God consists in being the only thing that's like that, which is actually what, I mean, no theologian I know in history has said that. They've said our image belongs to the capacity to have relationships, or a relationship with God, or your role in creation as steward, or capacities like having memory and intellect and will, or freedom, or moral responsibility. People don't say what makes you in the image of God is that there's nothing else like you. I just think that's a bit of a fallacy. It may well be true, perhaps it is true, that we're the only creatures on this planet that bear the image of God, but it doesn't consist in us being unique. I also think that if there's other life out there, it can bear the image of God and still be very different from what we are. So no other creature out there will have the string quartets of Beethoven. And I reckon it's a pretty great, flag of honor to have the string quartets of Beethoven. And they'll have their own wonderful cultural artifacts. And we can all be in the image of God and also be extraordinarily different and have our own stories and cultures, and that's a wonderful thing. I also think that some of this is just a matter of temperament. So I think I am, glad to say, by nature, just not easily threatened, I think. And I tend not to go for zero-sum thinking. I don't think that more of this means less of that, generally speaking. So if it turns out that other things are in the image of God, I just say, great, the more the merrier. If it turns out that dolphins have an amazing moral life, or chimpanzees have some extraordinary secret, cultural life that we don't know about, or something like that, they're made in the image of God, fine. I don't feel any less what I am. And you are no less wonderfully what you are, because other things might also be terrific. So I think there's something almost about mindset. It's quite difficult to argue with people who have this perspective. I think it's sort of quite deep-seated. Finally, the incarnation, which is, after all, at the heart of Christianity. Well, until the 20th century, it was pretty much taken for granted that life beyond Earth didn't raise the prospect of more than one incarnation. I know of one seeming exception, but it proves the rule. There's a British MP, I think he's around at the time of the Commonwealth, who talks about other incarnations, but he turns out to be an Arian. So we're in the year of celebrating the Council of Nicaea and the Nicene Creed. Part of its inspiration was to say that Jesus isn't just the most exalted creature, but God incarnate. If you think that Jesus is just an exalted creature, then you can kind of multiply that as much as you want. And unfortunately, this MP did hold that perspective. But in terms of what you might call historical Christian theology, people just don't raise the prospect of life, of multiple incarnations until the 20th century, when all of a sudden it takes off. So there's especially in poetry, I quite like the idea of poetry as being a wonderful laboratory, a kind of speculative arena for thinking new theological thoughts. There's a wonderful poem by Alice Meynell, which I will close by reading, called Christ in the Universe. And there's also one in Scots by Hugh MacDiarmid, writing as Christopher Murray. I think I probably will spare you my attempt at pronouncing Scots. But it basically goes along the line of, when the earth is as cold as the moon, and all its folk are long since dead, on countless stars the babe must cry, and the crucified man must bleed. It's in Scots originally, but that's a translation. And so 4 or 5 of the chapters in my book are on the incarnation, and I think it is a really good example of how this is worthwhile thinking about, even if we never discover life beyond Earth, because it allows us to come at all questions from new angles. And there's a beautiful discussion of this in one of my theological heroes, Eric Maskell, who turns out to be buried in the churchyard of the cathedral where I'm now on the chapter. And he said, it's good every now and again to take theological ideas out for a scamper on the fields. He's thinking of them as dogs, where there are very few hedges or barriers, and they can run around. And he said they'll be all the healthier for it, these theological ideas, when you bring them back home, if they've been able to scamper around for a little while. And he actually has thinking about life beyond Earth as his example. That's what he's doing at this particular time when he says it. So when I say to students something like, imagine there's a planet beyond Earth and it has creatures on it and they're rational and moral and so on, and they don't do the stupid thing and they don't sin. It's a sinless planet. Has Jesus got anything to do with them? Would they need another incarnation? And quite often students say to me, no, that's fine, that's like irrelevant. But then this is a really good way of asking ourselves, well, is the incarnation here just about the remedy for sin? Plenty of people haven't thought that. I think it is the remedy for sin, but I think it's far more than that. I think that what God offers us in Christ is far more than just a restoration job. It's an offer of being children of God. It's an offer of participating in the divine nature. It's an offer of seeing God face to face. Whatever you think of the story of fall and redemption, what God offers us in Christ is far more, raises us far higher than anything we ever fell from. And for that reason, I think if there's life beyond Earth and it doesn't go down the path of being selfish, if that's possible, there's still every reason to think that God coming among us as a creature is relevant for it, and that what is offered either through our incarnation or one of their own is still completely relevant, because the incarnation is not just about a remedy for sin. I think it's also really important to be quite precise about what you mean when you talk about some of this stuff. Quite a lot of the writing about incarnations and multiple incarnations in the last couple of decades has been quite imprecise. So there was a trend for talking about a planet-hopping Christ. Did we believe in a planet-hopping Christ? Well, I don't. I do believe that there could be more than one incarnation, but I don't believe in a planet-hopping Christ. Why? Because Christ is the man, the human being, Jesus Christ. And I don't think that the man, the human being, Jesus Christ, would be present on other planets. If for no other reason that he probably wouldn't survive in most, other planets. If we're talking about more than one incarnation, we're talking about God taking up, uniting himself to another creaturely nature. Not another Jesus Christ, because Jesus is human, but God taking up a Venetian, if that's the adjective for someone who lives on Venus, a Venetian nature, a Martian nature. And not that God would become incarnate as Jesus and then stop, but because the traditional line is that having taken up human nature, that's united to God forever, but that alongside that taking up, there would be these other examples. People might not subscribe to that Christology. I'm a Nicene, Chalcedonian kind of person, but I think it's really important that we put down on paper what it is that we think we mean when we talk about the incarnation, because otherwise we're just going to be talking at cross purposes. I always think it's a really useful way of thinking about what is the business of theology? What kind of mode or manner do we argue in? So you get people who write about possibility. Would more than one incarnation be possible? That's kind of okay up to a point. I suppose one shouldn't say absolutely ridiculous things. But there are quite a lot of people who write about whether other incarnations are necessary. And I have to say, I find this completely the wrong way to do theology. I cannot sit in God's chair and think what it will be necessary for God to do or not to do. I think that's arrogant. What I can do, and again this is following something that's beloved of Thomas Aquinas, is to say, God will do what's right, but I can perhaps try to enter into a question of what would seem to be fitting or suitable. I might get that wrong, but I am sure that God will do the beautifully suitable or fitting thing. And in that almost more poetic register, or often it's quite like the register of writing a hymn to celebrate how beautifully suitable or fitting what it is that God has done. That seems to me the right register for theology, rather than the rather colder, more abstract register, and I think arrogant register of what God has to do. So I've found that my thinking in theology has really, I very much embraced this idea that it's about exploring the beautiful suitability of what God has done, and working about life on Earth life beyond Earth has really sharpened that for me. So I'll end with my Star Wars analogy. I do, as it happens, I'm very warmly disposed towards the idea that there might be life beyond Earth. God will do the right thing. It'll be an interesting thing to find out, maybe beyond this life, what has been the case. But if you put me in a sharp position and say, Andrew, tell me what you think, then my instinct is towards more than one incarnation. And I think about this, I get at this from the perspective of what would happen if the shoe was on the other foot. What if there's lots of life in the universe and there's only one incarnation and it's not on Earth? What would that mean for us? Well, instead of opening Luke's Gospel and finding that it begins, in the 9th month, the angel Gabriel was sent to a virgin whose name was Mary, as opposed to a man whose name was Joseph, and so on and so on and so on. Be it unto me according to thy word. You would open Luke's Gospel and it would say, long ago, in a galaxy far, far away, a creature that you cannot possibly understand had this thing happen to it, which you can't possibly understand. And then 20, however many chapters there are in Luke, of stories that I can have absolutely no purchase on at all, because I have just no sense of this creature's form of life. And you get to the end of Luke's Gospel and it says, and by the way, God loves you, and you're redeemed from your sins, and you're invited to be a child of God, and so on. Now, that could work. I absolutely do think that if one incarnation in the whole universe could redeem everything and show God's love for us and friendship. But it just doesn't quite feel like what it is to inhabit the Christian story, which is that God came among us and was seen face to face. And yes, dealt with our sin, but also, Aquinas is great on this, became our friend. And the only way that God could be our friend is to be, like us. And there's a beautiful line in the ancient Eucharistic preface for Christmas. It says, here we see our God made visible, and are so caught up with the love of the God whom we can see that our hearts are raised to God whom we cannot see. And it seems to me that this seeing God face to face in a face that's recognizably our face is pretty central to Christianity. And just really for that reason, it feels to me like God would deal with other creatures as intimately as God has dealt with us. And I don't see any theological problems with there being more than one incarnation. But like I say, one will be enough, and God will do the right thing. So I'm going to end with this poem. It was written in 1911, I think. Alice Meynell, British, English, Roman Catholic. And I think it's rather a wonderful exploration of life beyond Earth. I think maybe it's useful, just so you know what's happening. It's partly a thought experiment of creatures of different kinds meeting in the life of the world to come and comparing notes about how God has dealt with them. With this ambiguous earth, his dealings have been told us. These abide, the signal to a maid, the human birth, the lesson, and the young man crucified. But not a star of all the innumerable host of stars has heard how he administered this terrestrial ball. Our race have kept their Lord's entrusted word. Of his earth-visiting feet, none knows the secret, cherished, perilous, the terrible, shamefast, frightened, whispered, sweet, heart-shattering secret of his way with us. No planet knows that this, our wayside planet, carrying land and wave, love and life multiplied, and pain and bliss, bears as chief treasure one forsaken grave. Nor, in our little day, may his devices with the heavens be guessed, his pilgrimage to tread the Milky Way, or his bestowals there be manifest. But in the eternities, doubtless we shall compare together here 1,000,000 alien gospels in what guise he trod the Pleiades, the lyre, the bear. Oh, be prepared, my soul, to read the inconceivable, to scan the myriad forms of God those stars unroll, when, in our turn, we show to them a man. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for an eloquent trek through your work. And of course, there are copies of the book that Andrew is willing to sign. You'll be signing mine. I'll be happy for you to do that since I've purchased it and have you do that. But what I so appreciate, because there's several of my students here who I've subjected to this great lecture, and of course, in honor of Daniel Walker Howe and this great inaugural series that we have. I just so appreciate that you are here at St. Albans, right next to UCLA, thinking with us about some of these grand topics, not just related to religion and theology, but also science, astrobiology, and really thinking about reality from within your tradition. Right? Trying to hold these tensions together when it's assumed by a lot of people, probably especially in this country, that if we did find there's life on other planets, it's going to freak people out in their religious communities. And now we're learning that that may not be the case. You're engaging religious thoughts, but while also engaging other forms of knowledge. You're I think, reflecting on, I've hung out with these scholars who are part of the Diverse Intelligences initiative, and some of them will simply say, well, if an alien does sort of land here on the planet, whether it's the White House or Westminster, whatever that happens to be, we're all going to be in a place where we probably should have been kinder to one another, right? And maybe against selfishness and also toward humility. But you've also made some very interesting moves, and I think before we throw this open to the audience, I've got a question for you, maybe a couple, but I'll try to reduce it maybe to one if I can distill it. How you're noticing that, you're making some moves theologically, and probably can be grateful that it's not the Inquisition time now to sort of make some of the moves that you're making from within Christian theology. But I like how you're holding things also, but to say multiple incarnations in other places, other creaturely expressions. But because we are in the city of angels, I appreciate you giving a shout out to whatever angels may be in the room, unawares. But I don't know, and I haven't gotten through the book yet, but I want to ask you a question about Augustine. Okay, so within the tradition. In Augustine's City of God, he talks a lot about demons demons. And you can't tell whether he's talking about actual demons or actual humans. Sometimes they sort of elide between one another. And so, I guess it's the question of corporeality and what if we're thinking about life beyond planet Earth, life out in the universe, and how that would make you expand some of your beliefs, multiplying things. My question is, I guess, about immaterial beings, right? And if we can speak about that are creaturely, and how that relates to some of the research that you did for writing this book.
Well, Augustine is a great author, of course, perhaps the single most significant writer in the history of the Western Church. And the City of God is a fascinating document to read. I think it's in the City of God where he talks about whether there would be creatures at the other side of the earth, the antipodes. So this is one of the few places very early on where people think about the possibility of other creatures that are not descended from us, from Adam, say, and whether there could be this parallel upon the earth. And unfortunately, Augustine doesn't come off brilliantly here, because it's the whole, they would fall off, sort of bad science. But it's by the Middle Ages, when you get to Albert the Great, patron saint of scientists and a very considerable scientific thinker, he's already got over all of this. He says, well, you could travel by ship, and people move between continents, and we're probably all descended from one another, so the problem goes away. The other place in the City of God where Augustine's very interesting for this is he talks about, I think he would describe them as monsters, but by that he just means something that is a cause of wonder. I think the Latin is basically a startling thing. And he thinks that the world is full of creatures that are just rather different from us. They may be descended from us, they might not be. And he's incredibly sort of gentle and generous and warm-hearted towards them. So that's a nice another example of this imagination of there being more than one sort of thing in the world. As for immaterial creatures, I guess you can do without angels in Christian theology, but I think it would be a bit boring. So I certainly parted my view of things. But following Aquinas' vision, it's about the world being full of lots of different kinds of things, and that there are inorganic things, there are plants, there are animals, there are rational creatures, and in this vision there are also rational beings that are not material. And this is about sort of populating all the different levels of being, and it being kind of bursting with variety. But for that reason, I don't think I have very much to say about them, because they're just so beyond. For instance, I don't think you could do experiments that would, because our experiments are to do with matter. So I just think Christians may or may not have reasons for thinking that angels are part of God's picture. They're pretty ubiquitous in the scriptures, but if they're immaterial, I just don't think that that we can have any kind of empirical thing to say, I'm afraid. That's not a very exciting answer to give, but...
No, that's really interesting, because you're also recognizing, I think, limits on theology as well as the nature of scientific inquiry, sort of holding these distinctions of modes of reasoning.
You mentioned demons. There are people who think that UFOs are demonic. And there's an interesting discussion in his book by Angels by Billy Graham. And he says, this is just silly. There's absolutely no so he's so he's quite open to the idea of there being whatever we're supposed to call them nowadays, not UFOs. But he thinks there's no reason to suppose that they're evil. So this is a trope that comes up quite a lot, this other things as demons. And Billy Graham puts that to rest.
Okay, well, there's a lot on the table, and we've got some time for questions with Professor Davison, so we should let it rip in the audience. If you'd like, we have some mics that we can bring around. I can bring them, or Adam can. John, right here.
The sentiment that Christians would think one way, but turns out largely we don't. Did that change at some point? Was there, like, as people realized the stars in the sky were in fact fiery suns like our own, like, is there a point you see a transition, or does it turn out we've just always been more accommodating in this way?
Well, the specifically social science study is maybe about 15 years old. I don't know of any previous one that we could compare. I suppose what one can do is think about what's been written, but I'm in the presence of a distinguished historian, and I think there are historiographical questions about, like, selection bias, for instance. So I can't claim to have read everything that's ever been written about life beyond Earth, but I have quite assiduously tried to seek out what's there, and, like I say, all sorts of questions about selection bias, but the picture looks something like this. It starts in the 15th century. First few examples, I'm not worried about it. My hunch is there's a century or so when the church has got other fish to fry and everyone's busy burning one another at the stake and so on. And so the portcullis comes down, the drawbridge is pulled up, and people are just not quite so willing to think speculative thoughts. And then the dust settles, and the scholastic method of asking yourself what about questions comes back in Protestantism as well as remaining Catholicism. And yeah, maybe there's a big corpus of literature out there that's writing about how terrible the idea is, but there's certainly just like a heartbeat of, it never goes away. Harper's Bazaar magazine in the early 20th century had a front cover story, I think, about life beyond Earth. There's a Catholic sort of children's book from the 1960s about it. It's just, there are Dutch people, there's a very significant person in Scotland writing about it. So that would suggest to me that once the Reformation anguish had died away, at least the theologians are not worried about it. And the trollop is interesting. It'd be good to know if there are other depictions of supposedly depictions of everyday life in which this comes up. But that's the only one I know of. But it's rather amazing that it exists at all, I think.
Thank you very much. I wonder how much our perception of what's acceptable, what can we put into our heads is based, in fact, on our religious upbringing. What comes to mind right away is that I was a parochial school student, and probably in 1962, when we were busy attempting to go into space, in parochial school, I had one of the Catholic sisters teaching us talk about the classic Miller-Urey experiment, in which, great big beakers of glass had some basic chemicals put in them, little discharges of electricity to prime chemical reactions, and thus, were born some very simple compounds. I'm a virologist in my research. I was recently at a journal club where this experiment has been updated so much to bring some newer facets to it. But I was, in retrospect, thinking how fascinating it was. This Catholic sister is busy telling us about angels and the nature of God and other mysteries to us, that she was so accepting of the science that this is how life would be created in the creation, and and it was acceptable to her based on her understanding of the creation story. So here's my question. How accepting are other religious people with other creation stories? Do Hindus equally or less, for example, accept the notion that there might be exoplanets with life? Is there any study on that?
So I think I have to plead almost complete ignorance of Asian religions. It just would be not fair for me to try to speak for them. Islam is an interesting case because, at least on one interpretation, there's reference to life beyond earth in the Quran, so that embeds it pretty early on. And within Judaism, you've already got, even before the time that I'm mentioning in the 15th century, I think you've already got two rival schools about this question. One that tends to think there's lots, including even has a number, 16,000 or something, worlds. And there's, I think Maimonides takes a line against that. He might even change his view over the course of his lifetime. So there are two examples. And one of the best articles, I would say, I think it was written in 1963, is by a rabbi called Norman Lamb, Lamm, I think. And definitely lots of things there that are relevant to Christians. Beyond that, I would be wary of speaking about other religions. But just to pick up that point about the openness of the school towards the teaching of science, here I am. I've got a podium. I can make a point. The idea that theology and science are in some kind of intrinsic battle is a late 19th century, early 20th century myth. And if anybody in the theology and science world has done the most sterling work, I think, in the last few decades, it's been the historians. Ronald Numbers in this country, John Henley Brooke, Peter Harrison. I can argue till the cows come home, philosophically, that these things need not be in conflict. But when you get the historians that tell the story and say, look at this religious-sponsored scientific program. Look at this great scientist who was profoundly religious. Look at the, you only need one black swan to show that there can be black swans. And when you see that the history of science and religion, has its ups and its downs, but it's the idea that there's just this war is as a late 19th century invention. I think I have a clever pun here, which is that we normally say that the people who win the war write the history. In this case, it was the people who wrote the history who won the war, because there are these two books from the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, that paint everything that way as a conflict. Happily, this has been, really we've been disabused of it. Unfortunately, stories of people, extreme people going at one another makes for good newspaper coverage and television. Moderate people saying moderate, sensible things is great for the world, but it doesn't get into the media in quite the same way. But it wouldn't be wonderful. I think our church schools, our religious schools, they should just help to defeat this by being brilliant at teaching the sciences.
I have sort of two questions, and one may be a little more of a statement, but the first one is, have you thought about the potential locations for life within our solar system? I used to work at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. My last mission was the Europa Clipper, which is on its way to Europa to do some of the preliminary studies that are looking at habitability. I just wonder if if that has entered your thinking at all. But Europa isn't alone. There's also a moon of Saturn Iapetus that may also be a harbor for life.
So, the wonderful thing about having a hand in this center and just being in the university at all, really, is that I get to hang out with amazing scientists. And I don't work on life on Mars, but there are plenty of people who do, and I get to talk about it with them. So Mars has sort of come back into the frame again, simply because there may be liquid water for at least part of the year. Now, why is there liquid water? Because there are incredibly strong levels of perchlorate, which is basically weed killer, so it may not be the most promising place for life, but life survives in extraordinary places on Earth. And there was a Viking lander. The experiment there is a little bit contested. But the moons are absolute. So the 16 billion Earth-like planets around sun-like stars, perhaps. The other place that there could be life is moons. And the three largest bodies of liquid water in the solar system are not Earth. I think Earth comes in at number 4. And it's just a wonderful bit of science here. So how on Earth do these moons around these far, far planets retain liquid water? You'd think they'd be absolutely frozen solid, and it's beautiful. Orbits are elliptical, they're not circular. They can be circular, but that's just an example of an ellipse. So your moon ends up being a bit nearer the planet and a little bit further than the planet. It's like this. And this difference in gravity from being near the planet and further away exerts a kind of kneading influence on the planet. And that transfers enough energy to keep the liquid water underneath the kind of protective crust of insulating ice. So there's a great question in front of NASA and the European Space Agency, which is which of these enormous pools of water do they go and drill through the crust and go looking for what's there. There's also Titan, which is, that has liquids on the surface, but they're liquid hydrocarbons and they're incredibly cold, and so I suspect that's probably not the best place to look. But so take your 16 billion and then add in the moons.
I guess the second question is, there's a lot of more contemporary science fiction that looks at theological questions, and some of it's really, I guess I would say things like Six and Lou's dark forest analogy for the universe, which is very dark, but also Maria Doria Russell, which is a really interesting book, or sorry, I'm forgetting the name. Oh, James Blish. He writes about a race of aliens who don't sin, but things go very badly. And I wonder if you've thought about any of those concepts in some of the thinking you've done.
Well, when I was in Princeton the first time, I've just been there for 2 years, but I was there earlier on. Mary Doria Russell came and spoke to this group of us working on astrobiology. The book's called The Sparrow. There's also a successor to it. It is pretty gruesome by the end, so I don't recommend it lightly for that reason. Then also the man who wrote The Scarlet Petal and the Red, or something like that. Faber is he called? Maybe it's published by Faber. He's written another book about Jesuits in space. And they are sort of, they're the great explorers. It's perfectly natural to cast them. So I think, yes, science fiction is a great laboratory for thinking ideas. I read a lot as a younger person. I haven't read very much recently. I edited a book series of Cambridge University Press on theology and science, and I'm pleased that I've got a volume coming out soon on the place of science fiction as a bearer, as an arena for thinking about theology and science questions. But it's beyond my particular expertise, but I'm glad to have those suggestions. And on the question of the Uri Miller experiment, I was in Princeton last night and I was giving a talk, the Witherspoon lecture, I think it was called, and there I tracked away from the subject of the book, which is other intelligent life, towards the other end of the scale, which is the origin of life at all. And I was asking the question, what can Christian theology make of the idea of a natural origin of life? So if you want even more Thomas Aquinas and Augustine about how I think Christianity can take it in its stride, then that lecture will be put up quite soon, I think. Maybe it's up already. So the Center of Theological Inquiry, as you would say, in Princeton, which is a great outfit, which has twice had me as a visiting member, and it's where I wrote the book. That lecture will be up quite soon, and if you want to think about the transition from the non-living into the living, then you can hear me talk about that there.
More of a broad question. And if not, what drove you to the Thomistic tradition?
Sorry, could you repeat that, because it wasn't quite distinct?
Yeah.
I think the microphone might not be quite working. Maybe try the other one.
Thanks. This is kind of a broader question, but throughout your years of study, have you always had faith? Or if not, what drew you to the Thomistic, more classic tradition of theology?
Oh, goodness. If I had planted that question, I couldn't have asked for a better question. So I grew up middle of the road Anglican in a rural parish in Yorkshire. When I went to secondary school, high school you would say, I became really quite evangelical and shook the dust of the Church of England off my feet and joined a local house church. So I went up to Oxford thinking the world was made in 6 days, 6,000 years ago, and pretty soon found that the science is stacked against that. And that precipitated a real crisis of faith. And I think the two things that saved it really were the wonderful liturgical tradition of my college chapel, Merton in Oxford, which was just, it wasn't all about how I felt. It was about the grandeur and the greatness of the Christian story and the creation and so on. And that was very helpful when everything was in a bit of turmoil, to sense that you were just part of something that was so much bigger and it wasn't about particularly how you were feeling. But also that my Catholic friends, my first Catholics I'd known, because I was, as I say, really pretty conservative Protestant, introduced me to medieval scholastic thought. And I just instinctively thought, these people, all the things that are worrying me in a really anguished kind of way, they would have been fascinated by them. They loved posing themselves questions and learning from responding to objections. And your average 14th century Dominican in Paris would have just had a field day with evolution and all these sorts of things. So that's the story. And when the dust had settled, I thought the things that were keeping me awake previously in an anguished kind of way were still keeping me awake, but in a fascinated way. And I thought, this is a pretty good sign that maybe my path doesn't lie along biochemistry. Because wonderful that biochemistry is, I wasn't lying awake thinking about biochemistry, but I was lying awake thinking about philosophy and theology and ethics and Thomas Aquinas. So happily, I managed to bring the science back into my life in due course. And then, so I put myself forward for ordination and took a theological track.
Ireland, over to you.
Hi. So all of these different projects and these interests in going to different churches this past quarter has made me really want to be involved more in churches. I'm wondering what you have to say towards people who don't necessarily believe in what the church is saying, but are going for the community and are going out of curiosity. What are the ethical implications of that, and would you support or encourage that?
I would encourage it. I think that churches should have porous boundaries and open doors, and probably one door that isn't has no priest, prowling by it, where people can just slip in and out if they want to. I think that if something's true, it's probably also good and beautiful, and it's perfectly fine that what one could see that was compelling might be its beauty or its goodness. So I think plenty of people, there's a wonderful church I know in New York that for the past 30 years has been running a soup kitchen and serves 1,000 meals a day. And lots of people have come into the community of that church because there were people of goodwill and they saw people were starving and they wanted to just be shoulder to shoulder with people who are making a difference. And I think one absolutely sees what Christianity should be about in that action as well as what's preached from the pulpit. Now, I would say probably the church should be completely welcoming, but also say this is what we believe. So we will recite the creed, and you don't have to recite it. There's no inquisition. But we're also going to be we'll be welcoming, but we're not going to be watering things down. And I think that probably, if people are exploring, they kind of want the church to be the church, and you can engage with it in all sorts of different ways. And having been a college chaplain, assistant chaplain, and then dean of chapel in another college, this is what, for me, student ministry is all about. Concentric circles, porous boundaries, often services that are quite liturgical, and people love the old-fashioned 1662 language because, it's part of heritage that we share, and also it's kind of weird enough that people can relate to it in all sorts of different ways. And I think that sort of student ministry as well can represent this wonderful thing, Christian humanism. That, we think of humanism as a badge has been nowadays associated with atheism, but back in the 15th century, Nicholas of Cusa and the centuries afterwards, and actually probably earlier as well, there was this sense of the glory of being made in the image of God, and the glory of human relationships, and the glory of human creativity and intellect. Now that can go out of control and we can become hubristic, but the church should be a place where everything human is celebrated. There's a line from one of Terence's Latin plays, I am human and nothing human is alien to me. And I always thought that that pagan line was a great motto for university chaplaincy, for really theological reasons. So if here and other places you can have an experience, we are human and nothing human is alien to us, then that's the church doing its job, I think.
You know, it's also interesting, I think, Andrew, and an interesting conversation, I think, between where you work, the University of Oxford, and, you know, which is a place that has chapels throughout. You know, some of you may end up studying at Oxford and have been faculty at Oxford, right. So it's a different context, but I think one in which open inquiry is, you know, looks different in California with institutions, much different in an establishment situation. But I think we are just about out of time. But because you brought up sci-fi, Kim Stanley Robinson was just giving a talk last week, and he concluded after his Mars trilogy that Life on Mars, and you brought up the other, you know, it's a conversation. You know, that also some tech bros, or one particular tech bro, would like to see advance. But Mars for you, would you go?
No, absolutely not.
Okay.
No, I think that for two reasons. One, it would be to throw one's life away. No one would survive under that radiation. And I think that Christian senses of the value of human life probably prohibit Mars exploration until it becomes incredibly much more safe than it is. I also think we have one planet, it's in desperate ecological state. We should put the money that we have to putting this one right, rather than you know, actually degrade the planet by all these you know, rockets and things. And it actually wouldn't take very many moon shots to plant 1 billion trees. And so if the billionaires of California are listening, I think there's a great work to be done, and it's saving this precious planet and not fantasizing about trips to other ones.
Thank you so very much, Professor Davison. St. Albans Hospitality Committee, which is led by Deb Ricketts and Fred Caruso, wave your hands at us, please, both of you, have laid out quite a spread for us out here in the hallway and in the parish library, right outside these doors, either to your right or just directly across the hall. Please don't leave here hungry this evening. There's plenty of food. We would love to get to know you better, have some time of fellowship, and also for you to interact with Professor Davison. And if you'd like, he has books available for sale just near our parish offices, just out these doors and to the left. You'll find him. He's ready to sign your book, and the proceeds for book sales this evening go to support the Howe lectures here at St. Albans. I also want all of you who are visiting from across the street from UCLA, we hope that you will also join us at some point for Canterbury, which is our young adult and campus ministry here at St. Albans. It meets on Thursday evenings at 6:30 in our historic chapel just across our patio here. We start there at 6:30. We have supper together here in this building, and then some time of discussion and exploration. Everybody is welcome, and no matter if you call yourself a Christian, or you're curious, or you just want to know more, or just want to be in community with others, we welcome you here. We are glad you're here, and we always welcome you in this holy place, no matter where you are in your faith journey. So please stick around this evening so we get to know you better. Please stick around and meet with and have some time with Professor Davison and enjoy this beautiful space. Thank you again so very much for being here tonight. Welcome to St. Albans as always. God bless you.